I never expected that a few feathered friends in my backyard would ignite a neighborhood war. But that's exactly what happened when Patricia Wilkins decided my chickens were public enemy number one. It all started on a deceptively peaceful Sunday morning in Maple Creek, a supposedly idyllic suburb of Columbus, Ohio, where I'd been living for just over 8 months. My name is Samuel Bennett, but everyone calls me Sam. I'd purchased my modest 3-bedroom home on Oak Ridge Lane after years of apartment living, drawn by the spacious yard and the promise of a quieter life away from the city center. What I hadn't factored into my decision was the Maple Creek Homeowners Association and its most zealous enforcer, Patricia. I was enjoying my morning coffee on the back deck that Sunday, watching my small flock of 6 hens pecking contentedly in their enclosed run. The chicken coop I'd built was a thing of beauty cedar-sided, with a sloped roof, proper ventilation, and a secure run that protected my girls from predators. I'd researched extensively before bringing them home, making sure I understood both the care requirements and local regulations. "Excuse me." "Hello, excuse me." The shrill voice pierced through my peaceful morning like a siren. I turned to see a woman with a meticulously styled blonde bob and oversized sunglasses standing at the edge of my property, her hands on her hips. "Can I help you?" I called, setting down my coffee mug. "Are those chickens?" She pointed accusingly at my hens. I nodded. "Yes, they are. 6 hens, no roosters." "I'm Patricia Wilkins, Vice President of the Maple Creek HOA," she announced, marching closer. "And livestock is expressly forbidden in our community." Thus began my unwitting battle against the HOA that would consume the next 6 months of my life and teach me more about municipal codes, zoning laws, and neighborhood politics than I ever wanted to know. "I checked the HOA rules before building the coop," I explained calmly. "There's nothing specifically prohibiting chickens." Patricia's thin lips pressed into an even thinner line. "Section 8, Paragraph 3 clearly states that no livestock or farm animals are permitted on residential properties. Chickens kept as pets in limited numbers aren't classified as livestock according to Columbus City Code," I countered. I had done my homework. "These rules exist for a reason, Mr. Bennett. The noise, the smell, the unsightly structures, they reduce property values. I'll be filing a formal complaint." With that, she spun on her heel and marched off, leaving me bewildered in my yard. I spent the remainder of that Sunday reviewing the HOA covenant I'd received when purchasing the house. As I suspected, the language was vague regarding animals, specifically prohibiting livestock, but with no clear definition of what constituted livestock. City ordinances, however, were more specific, allowing up to 6 hens, no roosters, on residential properties of my size, provided proper housing and setbacks from property lines were maintained. 3 days later, an official-looking letter arrived in my mailbox. The Maple Creek HOA was demanding I remove my unauthorized livestock within 7 days or face daily fines of $100. The letter was signed by Gregory Peterson, HOA president, but I had no doubt who was behind it. I immediately called the number listed on the HOA letterhead. "Maple Creek HOA, this is Wendy speaking," a friendly voice answered. "Hi, Wendy. This is Sam Bennett from 1847 Oak Ridge Lane. I've received a violation notice about my chickens, and I'd like to discuss it." "Oh yes, Mr. Bennett. That complaint was filed by Mrs. Wilkins." "Let me transfer you to Mr. Peterson." After a brief hold, a deep voice came on the line. "Greg Peterson here. Mr. Peterson, I'm calling about the notice regarding my chickens. I've reviewed both the HOA covenant and city ordinances. Columbus specifically allows up to 6 hens on residential properties, which is what I have." There was a pause. "Mr. Bennett, I understand your position, but our covenant is clear about livestock not being permitted. Mrs. Wilkins has expressed concerns about noise and odor. My hens are quiet, clean, and contained. They're pets that happen to provide eggs. I've invested significant time and money into a proper setup that meets all city requirements. I'd like to request a hearing with the board." Another pause. "We can arrange that. The next board meeting is on the 15th. I'll add you to the agenda and send you a confirmation email." I thanked him and hung up, feeling a mix of determination and dread. I had 2 weeks to prepare my case, and I wasn't going to waste a minute. The next evening, I decided to meet my neighbors, hoping to find allies. I started with the houses on either side of mine. To my right lived the Johnsons, a retired couple who seemed genuinely interested in my chicken operation. "We've never had a problem with your chickens, Sam," Martha Johnson assured me. "In fact, I've enjoyed watching them from our sunroom. They're quite entertaining." Her husband Robert nodded in agreement. "Patricia's always finding something to complain about. Last year, she went after the Thompsons for their bird feeder, claiming it attracted vermin. This was valuable information. Would you be willing to speak at the HOA meeting or write a letter stating you don't have issues with my chickens?" They agreed without hesitation, and I left with my first allies in what I was beginning to realize would be a neighborhood battle. My neighbor to the left, a young woman named Whitney Baker who worked long hours as a surgical resident, was equally supportive. "I barely know they exist," she said. "And I'm right next door. Patricia lives 3 streets over, so how would she even know about them unless she was snooping around?" "That's exactly what I was wondering," I admitted. "Would you be willing to write a letter of support as well?" "Absolutely. And I can attend the meeting if I'm not on call. That woman has been the neighborhood nuisance since I moved in 2 years ago." Over the next week, I canvassed my immediate neighborhood, discovering that Patricia Wilkins had a reputation for zealously enforcing HOA rules, often to the point of harassment. I collected signatures from 12 neighbors who had no objection to my chickens, including a family whose children loved to visit my girls and help collect eggs. I also consulted with a lawyer friend, Michael Torres, who specialized in property law. He reviewed the HOA covenant and the city ordinances and confirmed my understanding. "The covenant doesn't specifically define livestock," Michael explained. "And in legal disputes involving ambiguity, courts often defer to municipal codes, which in Columbus clearly distinguish between a small number of hens kept as pets versus commercial livestock operations. You have a strong case, Sam. What should I expect at this hearing? Be prepared for emotional arguments about property values and neighborhood character. Come with facts, documentation of the relevant codes, and testimony from your neighbors. Photos of your setup would help to show how clean and well-maintained it is." I took his advice to heart, preparing a comprehensive presentation. I compiled a binder with the city ordinance, photos of my coop and run, letters from neighbors, and research on property values in neighborhoods with and without backyard chickens, which showed no negative correlation. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and I arrived early at the community center where it was being held. The room was already half full, with more residents arriving behind me. I recognized several neighbors who had offered support, and they gave me encouraging nods or pats on the shoulder as they passed. Patricia Wilkins was seated at the front table with 4 other board members, including Greg Peterson. She wore a crisp navy blazer and had a stack of papers in front of her. Our eyes met briefly, and her expression hardened. At 7:00 p.m. sharp, Greg Peterson called the meeting to order and went through routine business before reaching the agenda item titled animal violation at 1847 Oak Ridge Lane. Mr. Bennett has requested a hearing regarding a violation notice for keeping livestock on his property, Greg announced. Mrs. Wilkins filed the initial complaint. Patricia, would you like to present your concerns? Patricia stood, adjusting her blazer. Thank you, Greg. As the board knows, our covenant clearly prohibits livestock to maintain the residential character of Maple Creek. Mr. Bennett has constructed a chicken coop and is housing 6 chickens, which are farm animals. This violates our rules and sets a dangerous precedent. If we allow chickens, what's next, goats? Pigs? This is a residential neighborhood, not a farm. She continued for several minutes, describing potential odors, noise, and the unsightly structure in my backyard. She presented printouts of real estate articles, claiming that unusual or non-conforming property uses could reduce neighboring property values by up to 10%. Additionally, she concluded, chickens can carry diseases like salmonella and attract predators like foxes and coyotes to our neighborhood, creating a safety hazard for small pets and children. When she finally sat down, Greg thanked her and then turned to me. Mr. Bennett, you have the floor. I stood, carrying my binder to the front table. Thank you for allowing me to address this issue. I'd like to start by clarifying some facts about my chickens and the applicable regulations. I distributed copies of my prepared materials to the board members and began my presentation. First, Columbus City Code specifically permits up to 6 female chickens on residential properties, provided they're properly housed and maintained. My property exceeds the minimum size requirements, and my coop meets all setback and construction standards. I showed photos of my setup, highlighting the cleanliness and quality of construction. Second, the HOA covenant prohibits livestock but doesn't define what constitutes livestock. In cases of ambiguity, legal precedent typically defers to municipal code, which distinguishes between commercial livestock operations and a small number of pet chickens. I addressed each of Patricia's concerns methodically. I presented research showing that properly maintained chicken coops produce no more odor than a dog run. I explained that hens without roosters make very little noise, comparable to songbirds. I shared letters from my adjacent neighbors confirming they'd experienced no nuisance issues. As for property values, I continued, I've included a study from the University of Washington that found no negative impact on property values in neighborhoods that permit backyard chickens. In fact, some realtors now list backyard chicken keeping as a desirable feature for buyers interested in sustainability and locally sourced food. Finally, I introduced Martha and Robert Johnson, who spoke briefly about having no issues with my chickens despite living right next door, and Whitney Baker, who confirmed the same. In conclusion, I said, my chicken-keeping activities comply with city code, create no nuisance for my neighbors, and do not violate the intent of the HOA covenant to maintain the residential character and property values of our community. I respectfully request that the board recognize my right to keep my 6 hens. The room was silent for a moment after I finished. Greg Peterson cleared his throat. Thank you, Mr. Bennett. Does the board have questions for either party? A woman I recognized as the HOA treasurer spoke first. Mr. Bennett, how long have you had these chickens? About 3 months. I built the coop first and made sure everything was properly set up before bringing them home. And did you seek approval from the HOA before building the coop? I reviewed the covenants and didn't see anything requiring pre-approval for a structure of this size. It's under the square footage that requires approval according to Section 5. Another board member asked Patricia, Have you personally observed any nuisance issues with Mr. Bennett's chickens? Patricia hesitated. I've driven by several times and could see the coop from the street. It's an eyesore, and chicken coops are known to smell. But have you actually smelled anything or heard noise from his property? Well, no, but I have another question, interrupted the final board member. Mrs. Wilkins, how did you become aware of the chickens if you live several streets away? Patricia's cheeks flushed slightly. I was walking my dog and happened to notice construction in Mr. Bennett's backyard. I later saw the chickens and was concerned about covenant compliance. The questioning continued for another 20 minutes, with the board seeming increasingly skeptical of Patricia's complaints. Finally, Greg Peterson called for a vote. The board will now deliberate and vote on this matter. We'll take a 10-minute recess and then announce our decision. Those 10 minutes felt like hours. I chatted nervously with my supporting neighbors, who all thought I'd made a compelling case. When the board returned, Greg Peterson called the meeting back to order. After consideration of the evidence and arguments presented, the board has reached a decision regarding the complaint against Mr. Bennett's chickens. The room fell silent. By a vote of 4-1, the board finds that Mr. Bennett's keeping of 6 hens does not violate the Maple Creek HOA covenant as currently written. While the covenant prohibits livestock, we find that a small number of chickens kept as pets falls outside the common definition of livestock and is permitted by city ordinance. Therefore, the violation notice is rescinded. A murmur of approval ran through the room. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. However, Greg continued, to prevent future confusion, the board will draft a clarification to the covenant regarding permitted and prohibited animals for consideration at our annual meeting. Thank you all for your participation. Patricia's face had turned an alarming shade of red. She gathered her papers with shaking hands and stormed out of the meeting without another word. I thanked the board members and my supporting neighbors, feeling vindicated but aware that this might not be the end of the matter. Patricia Wilkins didn't strike me as someone who accepted defeat gracefully. I was right to be concerned. The next morning, I went out to check on my chickens and found the door to their run standing open. Thankfully, they were all huddled inside the coop, unharmed. I carefully examined the latch and found scratch marks around it. Someone had clearly tampered with it. I immediately installed a security camera overlooking the coop, not wanting to accuse anyone without evidence. But I had my suspicions. For the next few weeks, things remained quiet. I received occasional friendly waves from neighbors who had supported me, and several people stopped by to see the chickens and get eggs. Patricia avoided me completely, crossing the street if we happened to be walking in the same area. Then one evening in late October, my security camera caught movement near the coop around 10 p.m. The footage clearly showed Patricia Wilkins entering my backyard, approaching the chicken coop with something in her hand. She appeared to sprinkle something into their feed container before hurrying away. Alarmed, I immediately went to check. The feed looked normal, but I wasn't taking any chances. I emptied it completely and saved a sample in a plastic bag. The next morning, I took the sample to a veterinarian who specialized in poultry. I need to know if this has been tampered with, I explained, showing her the feed. I have chickens, and I'm concerned someone may have tried to harm them. Doctor. Lauren Mills examined the feed carefully and then looked up with concern. There are crushed pill fragments mixed in here. I'd need to run tests to be certain, but this looks like it could be rat poison. My blood ran cold. Can you document this officially? I may need to file a police report. Absolutely. I'll write up my findings and have the lab confirm the substance. With Dr. Mills' preliminary report in hand, I went directly to the police station and filed a report, showing them the security footage and the feed analysis. "This is disturbing, Mr. Bennett," said Officer Torres after reviewing everything. "Attempting to poison animals is a serious offense. We'll need to investigate further and speak with Mrs. Wilkins." 2 days later, Patricia Wilkins was arrested for animal cruelty and trespassing. The lab had confirmed that the substance was indeed rat poison, and the security footage provided irrefutable evidence of her actions. The story made local news, much to the embarrassment of the HOA board. Greg Peterson called an emergency board meeting, which I was invited to attend. "On behalf of the Maple Creek HOA, I want to apologize for what you've experienced," Greg said solemnly. "Mrs. Wilkins has been removed from the board, effective immediately. Her actions were reprehensible and in no way represent the values of our community." The other board members nodded in agreement, looking genuinely disturbed by what had happened. "We're also taking steps to review all recent complaints filed by Mrs. Wilkins to ensure there hasn't been a pattern of harassment toward other residents," added the treasurer. I appreciated their response, but was still shaken by how far Patricia had been willing to go. "Thank you. I'm just glad my chickens weren't harmed." In the weeks that followed, Patricia's case moved through the legal system. She eventually accepted a plea deal for misdemeanor animal cruelty and criminal trespassing, receiving probation, community service, and a restraining order requiring her to stay at least 500 feet from my property. She also put her house up for sale and moved away from Maple Creek. The HOA did revise their covenant to explicitly permit up to 6 hens, no roosters, on residential properties, provided they were properly housed and maintained. Greg Peterson even asked for my input on the specific language, wanting to ensure it was fair and reasonable. My chicken enterprise thrived. I expanded their run, built nesting boxes with automated doors, and my girls rewarded me with plenty of eggs. I started a small egg co-op with interested neighbors who received weekly deliveries in exchange for contributing to the cost of organic feed. The following spring, the HOA surprised me by asking if I would host an educational event about backyard chickens as part of a community sustainability initiative. Children from the neighborhood came to learn about caring for chickens, collecting eggs, and composting chicken waste for gardens. Even Greg Peterson attended, admitting that he'd been considering getting a few hens of his own. "You know, Sam," he said as we watched a group of children delightedly feeding my chickens, "sometimes the best thing that can happen to a community is having its rules challenged." I smiled, thinking about the journey of the past year. I never set out to be a neighborhood rebel. I just wanted some fresh eggs and a few feathered friends. Well, you ended up making our community stronger and more thoughtful about our rules, and you exposed a problem none of us wanted to see. He was right. What had started as a simple desire for backyard chickens had exposed deeper issues in how the HOA operated, and the unchecked power that someone like Patricia had been able to wield. The revised covenant now included clearer processes for filing complaints, more transparent enforcement procedures, and better appeals mechanisms. In a strange way, I had Patricia to thank for these positive changes. Her extreme reaction to my chickens had ultimately made Maple Creek a better place to live for everyone. The irony wasn't lost on me. As summer approached, I received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from a law firm representing Patricia Wilkins. My heart sank, thinking she was attempting some sort of civil suit despite her criminal conviction. But as I read the letter, I was stunned to find it contained a formal apology. "My client has instructed me to convey her sincere apologies for her actions regarding your property and animals," the letter read. "As part of her rehabilitation She has been encouraged to make amends where possible. She acknowledges that her behavior was inexcusable and wishes to express her regret for any distress caused to you and your pets. I wasn't sure how to feel about this unexpected apology. Was it sincere, or just part of her legal strategy to show remorse? Either way, it represented closure of a sort. That weekend, I installed a small sign on my fence. Bennett's backyard chickens educational visits welcome by appointment. It was my way of embracing my unexpected role as the neighborhood chicken ambassador. Martha Johnson from next door stopped by while I was putting up the sign. "You know, Sam, before all this happened, people in this neighborhood barely spoke to each other. Now look at us, we have community events. The children visit your chickens. People are talking about sustainability. You've changed things around here." "I just wanted eggs," I laughed. "Sometimes the smallest things create the biggest changes," she replied wisely. As I reflected on her words, I realized she was right. My 6 hens had created ripples that transformed our entire community. Where once there had been rigid enforcement of arbitrary rules, there was now thoughtful consideration of what made a neighborhood thrive. Where there had been isolation, there was now connection. The HOA still existed, of course. Rules were still necessary for community living. But now there was a spirit of collaboration rather than control, of education rather than enforcement. Greg Peterson had emerged as a more thoughtful leader, willing to listen and adapt. By midsummer, 3 other families in Maple Creek had installed chicken coops of their own, each one meeting the new guidelines that I had helped develop. I found myself regularly fielding questions about coop design, chicken care, and egg production. The community newsletter even gave me a monthly column, The Chicken Chronicles. 1 year after Patricia's initial complaint, Maple Creek held its annual summer block party. The highlight of the event was a cooking contest featuring, you guessed it, eggs from neighborhood chicken keepers. I served as a judge, sampling everything from quiches to frittatas to deviled eggs. Who would have thought we'd be celebrating the very thing that caused such controversy last year? Greg mused as we sampled a particularly delicious spinach and feta quiche. "Sometimes the things we resist the most are exactly what we need," I replied. The woman who won the contest, Olivia Chen, had been one of my first chicken-keeping converts. "I have to thank Sam," she said as she accepted her prize. Without his willingness to stand up for his chickens, none of us would be enjoying this today. The crowd applauded, and I felt a sense of pride that had nothing to do with winning or losing and everything to do with positive change. That evening, as I closed up the chicken coop and watched my girls settle in for the night, I reflected on the journey. What had begun as a simple hobby had turned into a neighborhood transformation, a legal battle, and ultimately, a community-building experience. My chickens Henrietta, Gertrude, Mabel, Opal, Penelope, and Dottie clucked contentedly, unaware of their role in all the drama. "You girls caused quite a stir," I told them, scattering a few mealworms as a bedtime treat, "but I think we're all better for it." As if in agreement, Henrietta let out a soft cluck and settled onto her perch. The next morning, I received an email from Greg Peterson with the subject line, "Proposal for Community Garden." He was suggesting using a vacant lot owned by the HOA to create a shared garden space where residents could grow vegetables and herbs. He asked if I would be interested in helping to develop the plan, particularly regarding how chicken manure from neighborhood coops could be composted for use in the garden. I replied immediately with my enthusiasm for the project. What had started with my small act of chicken keeping was evolving into a broader vision for a more sustainable, connected community. Over the next few months, the community garden took shape. Residents who had never spoken to each other before worked side by side, building raised beds, installing irrigation systems, and creating composting stations. My chicken manure composting workshop was surprisingly well attended, with people taking careful notes about the proper aging process to ensure safety. The garden became a gathering place, with weekend work parties that felt more like social events. Children learned where their food came from. Elderly residents shared gardening wisdom accumulated over decades, and people of all backgrounds found common ground in growing things. As fall approached, we harvested the first vegetables from the community garden and held a harvest festival. Tables overflowed with zucchini, tomatoes, peppers, and herbs, all grown in soil enriched by compost that included contributions from my chickens and the other backyard flocks that now existed in Maple Creek. Whitney Baker, my neighbor who worked as a surgical resident, told me the garden had become her therapy after long hospital shifts. "I never would have known this community if you hadn't stood up to Patricia last year," she said. "It's funny how one person can make such a difference." Her words stuck with me. I hadn't set out to be a community organizer or an agent of change. I just wanted to keep my chickens. But sometimes standing up for what you believe is right creates unexpected ripples. The HOA itself had transformed. Meetings now focused more on community enhancement than rule enforcement. When issues arose, the approach was education and problem-solving rather than punitive action. Greg Peterson had embraced a leadership style that emphasized building consensus rather than wielding authority. "I've been thinking about what happened with Patricia," he confided to me one day as we worked in the garden. She had been on the board for so long that she began to see the neighborhood as hers to control rather than a community to nurture. Power can do strange things to people. I nodded, understanding. It's easy to forget the purpose behind rules and focus only on enforcing them. Exactly. Your chickens reminded us all that rules should serve the community, not the other way around. As winter approached, we weatherproofed the chicken coops, insulating them against the cold Ohio weather. The community garden was put to bed with cover crops, and planning began for spring planting. Life settled into a pleasant rhythm, with the neighborhood feeling more like a true community than it ever had before. In December, I received a Christmas card with an unfamiliar return address from a town about 50 miles away. Inside was a note from Patricia Wilkins. "Mr. Bennett," it read, "I want to apologize again for my behavior regarding your chickens. The counseling I've received as part of my probation has helped me recognize patterns of control and rigidity in my life that led to my inexcusable actions. I'm working to change. I hear Maple Creek has become a more vibrant community since I left, and while it's painful to admit, I suspect that's not a coincidence. I wish you and your chickens well." It was signed simply Patricia, without the formal Mrs. Wilkins she had always insisted upon. I sat with the card for a long time, processing my feelings. The harm she had attempted to cause my chickens still disturbed me, but I also recognized the complexity of human behavior and the possibility of genuine change. I decided to accept her apology as sincere and move forward without harboring resentment. When spring arrived, Maple Creek held its first sustainability fair, featuring workshops on backyard chicken keeping, vegetable gardening, rainwater collection, and composting. People came from neighboring communities to learn and share ideas. Local news covered the event, highlighting how our HOA had evolved from a restrictive entity to one that actively promoted sustainable living practices. I led the chicken keeping workshop, of course, bringing along Henrietta, my friendliest hen, as a demonstration model. She behaved perfectly, allowing children to gently stroke her feathers while I explained the basics of chicken care. The most important thing to understand, I told the attendees, is that chickens are living beings deserving of proper care and respect. They're not just egg-producing machines, but creatures with distinct personalities and needs. After the workshop, a man approached me with his young daughter. "We're thinking about getting chickens," he explained, "but our HOA doesn't allow them." "How did you change your HOA's rules?" I smiled, thinking about the journey of the past 18 months. "It wasn't easy," I admitted, "but I started by really understanding the rules and the reasons behind them. Then I built a case based on facts rather than emotions, and I found allies who supported a more reasonable approach." "And he stood his ground," added Greg Peterson, who had been listening nearby. "Sometimes that's what it takes to create positive change, one person willing to stand firm on principle." The man nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe I'll try that approach. My daughter really wants chickens." "It's worth the effort," I assured him. "The joy they bring and the connections they create are more valuable than you can imagine." As I watched them walk away, I reflected on how my life had changed since that Sunday morning when Patricia Wilkins had first appeared at the edge of my yard. What had begun as a confrontation over 6 chickens had evolved into a transformation of an entire community's approach to sustainable living and governance. My chicken venture had expanded to 8 hens now, the maximum allowed under the revised HOA rules. Their eggs supplied not only my kitchen, but also a small egg subscription service for neighbors. The chicken manure, properly composted, helped the community garden flourish. And the lessons learned from standing up to unreasonable enforcement had rippled throughout Maple Creek in ways I could never have anticipated. That evening, as I collected the day's eggs, 8 perfect brown ovals, still warm from the nest, I felt a deep contentment. My chickens clucked and cooed around my feet, pecking at treats and going about their chicken business, oblivious to the controversy they had once caused or the community transformation they had helped inspire. Sometimes the most meaningful changes come from the simplest beginnings. For me, it had started with a desire for fresh eggs and feathered companions. For Maple Creek, it had started with one resident willing to challenge an unreasonable rule. As I closed up the coop for the night, I could see lights coming on in houses throughout the neighborhood. In many of those homes were people I now knew by name, people connected through community gardens, sustainability projects, and a shared vision of what a neighborhood could be. In some of those backyards were chicken coops, built with advice I had given and housing hens that were distant cousins to my own. The HOA still existed, with its meetings and rules and processes. But it had found a better balance between maintaining standards and fostering community, between preserving property values and promoting quality of life. And it had learned, sometimes painfully, that rules without reason or compassion create division rather than harmony. As for Patricia Wilkins, I hoped she had found peace in her new community. Her actions had been inexcusable, but they had also been a catalyst for positive change. Sometimes it takes a crisis to reveal what needs fixing. My phone pinged with a message from Greg Peterson. "Community garden planning meeting next Tuesday. Special focus on expanding the chicken manure composting system. You in?" I smiled and replied, "Absolutely. The girls and I wouldn't miss it." And so life continued in Maple Creek, forever changed by a conflict over backyard chickens and the zoning laws that had been on my side. What had once divided us had ultimately brought us together, creating a community where rules served people rather than constraining them, where sustainability was celebrated rather than prohibited, and where chickens simple, productive, Amusing chickens had a place in the suburban landscape. As Henrietta would say, if chickens could talk, sometimes you have to ruffle a few feathers to make things better for the whole flock.